Satoru Gojo's Infinity is pretty blatantly broken. When comparing Gojo with other powerful shonen stories and trying to power scale the quote-unquote strongest, you're gonna realize pretty quickly that outside of Jujutsu Kaisen, it's a very scary place for Satoru Gojo when talking about power scaling. Obviously, he doesn't just get blasted away by absolutely everybody, and there's still some people who can make up a pretty even matchup, like for example Muzan or the Hashira in Demon Slayer, or maybe even the Saibamen. When your universe is more consistently considered lightning timers at best, while you're also dodging Mach 3+ allegations, you just really gotta thug it out.
No one thinks Gojo is actually stronger than Goku and thinks
this is how you thug it out.
Having your quote-unquote existence erasing attack, Hollow Purple, not instantly erasing opponents on 3 occasions with one of them being Urame, means that there's a pretty serious problem when it comes to cross-verse conversations. But forget everything I just said, because Gojo is still very heavily debated against characters who can blow up entire planets or even universes. I've even discussed Sasuke versus Gojo before for nearly 30 minutes, and that fight shouldn't even be close. After making that nightmare of a video, it's very clear that the literal only reason that he's even mentioned in these discussions is because of quote-unquote infinity. When in doubt, just argue that your opponent can't bypass the limitless and it's GG. You're gonna end up watching your opponent do a deep dive into calculus to explain that Goku won't get bent over by Satoru Gojo, and it's gonna make you think that they just got hit with unlimited void. With his domain expansion also being incredibly busted, you don't really have to worry, because despite not having anything close to universal, there's still discussions about him beating Goku. This is because both his infinity and the limitless overall are considered hacks abilities, meaning you can't really apply the same counter arguments against these powers. With infinity fundamentally being rooted in real-world mathematics at its core, it means that there's room to discuss if anybody can pass through infinity. With this technique now being passively activated with an automatic targeting system, that means that Gojo can piss while not worrying about your attacks. Now, obviously, if you've seen chapter 236, also known as the happiest day of Sukuna's life, that generational trauma felt across the Gojo fandom only struck because obviously infinity can't protect him from absolutely anything. There's clearly an upper limit, and trying to understand infinity without giving myself a migraine would definitely be the best starting point. Gojo's Limitless is spatial manipulation. Both blue and red are enhanced versions of the base form known as the neutral limitless or infinity. It's also impossible for me not to ask you to subscribe, because 99% of you guys who watch my videos just aren't subscribed, and overall, just please make sure to like the video. Infinity is everywhere within space itself, but that's also part of bringing this idea into his arsenal. In short, Gojo creates this seemingly infinite space between himself and his opponents. Within the finite space between himself and others, there's also this barrier containing infinity. It's not only stated within the fanbook, but the anime also very clearly depicts this bubble or barrier before Toji sliced through the infinity. Gojo's entire technique is not only powered by the limitless, but also controlled and executed through his 6 eyes. It's impossible to use the limitless without these special eyes, and these eyes allow Gojo to control space down to the atomic level. The simplest way to explain infinity would be that Gojo is just dividing space, but over and over and over again. But obviously this is more complicated than you might think. Gege Akutami, who's the author and the mangaka of Jujutsu Kaisen, he said before that he doesn't even really understand infinity, and we've seen entire math lectures where Gege Akutami brings on quote-unquote special grade mathematicians to attempt to explain the infinity. So while you might get lost along the way, just trust me, because you're gonna understand it pretty quickly. I've already given a pretty accurate explanation in that Sasuke versus Gojo video, so I'm just gonna be using part of that script again just to be transparent. When this technique is active, objects or projectiles rapidly slow down and seemingly stop completely. After entering this barrier, they're going to begin passing through the infinity. Objects aren't stopped necessarily, and they're going to keep traveling until momentum runs out and then stopped. Infinity can be simplified as the infinite division of space. Dividing space creates the infinity effect that's operating all around him. It's the concept from the tortoise and Achilles paradox. When the runner moves forward, you're going to find that the tortoise keeps moving but only half of the distance. Constantly dividing any positive number by half or 0.5 will always return some other positive value. Over time, this creates an infinite sequence of increasingly smaller distances that the runner must cover to catch up to the tortoise. Gojo's infinity uses the same concept. Infinity is constantly dividing the distance between the caster and the objects that are crossing within its barrier. While the space itself between Gojo and others is finite, Gojo can create a seemingly infinite space to travel before you end up making contact. You'll never reach the caster because the objects will continue to travel but only half of the distance. They'll get closer but never complete. The space between them can appear endless, but that's because it's continuously being divided into smaller and smaller segments. That's infinity. It's not some key shield or some energy-powered bubble, but instead precisely manipulating space, meaning it's problematic for just about any shonen protagonist or really anybody from any fictional series. Essentially, he brings the concept of infinity into the real world. Gojo says that it's already something that's naturally there. Despite the distance between himself and his opponents being finite, Gojo can create this seemingly infinite space. I've already said before that the fanbook explains that this clan-inherited technique is actually functioning within a barrier that operates around Gojo, but one other thing, this barrier containing infinity can also be stretched and expanded and even shrunken down to look like Gojo's normal clothes. That barrier can appear thinly wrapped around his clothes, which makes it impossible to really tell if this technique is active. It's pretty much indistinguishable, but it can also sometimes stop targets from much farther away. Since Gojo evolved this technique, he's fixed most of its biggest evident problems, even accounting for the mental strain that Gojo would feel after focusing on using infinity for long periods of time. It makes it virtually impossible to end up outlasting him because he's always going to have reverse curse technique on. Infinity also has its own fully automatic and passive targeting system. Objects that are attempting to pass within its barrier can now be assigned a threat level that's based around various characteristics and properties. Using the object's mass, speed, shape, and even cursed energy can all help establish a threat level to even potential attacks. Even normal everyday objects that don't have cursed energy at all, like pencils and erasers, can also be assigned a threat level and then potentially stopped by infinity. It's also possible that Gojo himself can assign a threat level using the characteristics outside of mass, speed, shape, and cursed energy, and by using his own judgment. Assuming that there's enough time, Gojo can likely manually assign his opponents or targets as just generally threatening, making nearly anything incoming during a dangerous situation immediately halted by infinity. There are more scientific explanations to infinity, like ones that deep dive into mathematics and calculus, so if you're interested, I'd recommend watching those. Now, obviously that means that you can't just punch or slice through infinity with any ordinary attack, and that also means that he's nearly immediately limiting his opponent's arsenal to just techniques that can potentially bypass the limitless. While there are some who are lucky to have techniques that can potentially bypass infinity, when there's those who don't, it doesn't really matter how strong they are because nothing they have can ever touch Satoru Gojo. However, that aspect in infinity alone won't win him a fight. Other abilities like Unlimited Void are perfect for taking down opponents, but for that argument to work, we would need to know things like Gojo's reaction speed, combat speed, domain activation speed, and a ton of other things that aren't really the point of today's video. While infinity alone is definitely nearly the perfect defense, it's definitely not impenetrable. It is great, but it's definitely not perfect. When we understand infinity like this, we're already given multiple methods for bypassing this technique, and firstly and more obviously would be with existence erasure. Since infinity is brought into reality and existence within space, just like anything else, you can tear through Gojo's infinity without even making contact, just by ripping through space. Sukuna had done this exact thing using his dismantle, and others outside of Jujutsu Kaisen should be able to perform the same thing if they are capable. Existence erasure is more common than you would think within modern shonen. Beerus from Dragon Ball Super literally uses an ability powered by destruction called Hakai. When I say it's powered by destruction, I mean it's literally powered by destruction and can erase things completely from existence, and in some cases even a ghost or a spirit. Techniques that erase existence and destroy space itself would have no problem working beyond infinity, and just like Sukuna, they'll reach Gojo directly without worrying about interacting with the barrier. Other interesting abilities across media also don't require interacting with infinity whatsoever and can still harm Gojo. Ryuk and the Death Note is another perfect example. Just by scribbling his name quote Satoru Gojo into the Death Note, Light and any other user of the Death Note can kill anyone and remove them from the mortal world. If the cause of death is written within 40 seconds of writing the person's name, then they're already cooked. But that's also assuming that Light or any other Death Note author is fast enough, which they're obviously not. But again, this video isn't really focused about how far Gojo's stats get him, and it's more about how far infinity alone gets him outside of JJK. Both Hakai and Death Note are two very creative ways for getting around this annoying technique. Meaning you need to be pretty creative because the standard brute forcing isn't really gonna work, but that's only for most of the time. Many would argue that because Gojo's 6 size and infinity work on the atomic level, then that would mean that smaller attacks couldn't be stopped, and that's also kind of true. We can't really claim that infinity works beyond any level that we're given proper reason to speculate or rationalize, so we'd just be assuming. You can't really assume that because the 6 size work on the atomic level that this is the farthest infinity could target, and that would be ignorant. But there's also literally no way without making the assumption that it works beyond this level either, meaning while it's possible, there's nothing that really makes this theory likely. Objects that are smaller than atoms atoms like photons, which make up light, should be able to bypass infinity, or at the very least, it can't really be argued against working past or traveling undetected through the bubble. Attacks that are composed of light, which would be made out of photons, which are smaller than atoms, should make it through infinity and reach Satoru Gojo. But this argument also brings in two very big misconceptions. Light can bypass infinity because of its small size, and it has nothing to do with its speed. Many assume that just like light, if characters can move at light speed, then they should be able to blitz right through infinity. But this argument obviously doesn't make sense because being light speed doesn't make you photonic or compose your body of photons. You still exist beyond the atomic level and can be targeted and halted by infinity. There's also misconceptions around the potential attack that might partially be composed of light and not completely photonic. Let's say hypothetically, somebody launched their own attack that partially weaponizes light but is also powered by, let's say, Diddy Juice. Then this attack definitely shouldn't make it past infinity, or more obviously airport security, because there's nothing proving that Diddy Juice, which partially makes up this technique, is just as small as photons or has any of the properties that can bypass infinity, because the 6 eyes can only see on the atomic level. Infinity and the infinite division of space can obviously end up bypassed by characters with godly power that can move faster than infinite speed. Hypothetically, it shouldn't be impossible to move faster than the space that infinity can divide. If you're moving faster than the infinite division of space, then you should be able to run right through infinity. While Gojo might stop most of his opponents by trapping them in space that's always given more space to travel, characters with infinite speed that can cross entire infinite universes should be able to run through infinity. It's the classic example and probably the best way for reaching Satoru Gojo, but clearly impossible for 99% of shonen. Unless your infinite speed or your attacks work past the atomic level, we're back to talking about things like the Death Note or Beerus using Hakai. Infinity alone gets Gojo pretty far by just simply limiting his opponent's options. Without any specific technique, it's impossible to overcome this with raw power unless again you're like infinite speed or just have existence erasing punches. There are also techniques that work beyond the ethereal plane or exist in some other type of world, like Madara's limbo clones that don't exist in this dimension. They can fight and harm opponents in the normal world, but they aren't present in this reality. All it would take is one beaten up, sick, blind, tired, and dying of and it would have no problem taking down Satoru Gojo and touching through the infinity and ripping him a new one. Other abilities that more work around the soul, like the Reaper Death Seal, should also work. These techniques are completely spiritual, and in the case of the Reaper Death Seal, it doesn't work until it touches your soul, and by then, you're pretty much already fried. Obviously, the difference between this technique and something like Mahito's technique Idol Transfiguration would be that Mahito needs to make contact with you, which is clearly impossible with Satoru Gojo. Other soul-based sealing techniques across shonen that also don't require physical touch are also pretty threatening against infinity. Overall, there is one method for bypassing Gojo's infinity that I'm pretty sure is the most reliable outside of existence erasure, but again, it completely depends on the character's ability to neutralize or deactivate the Limitless. Within the series, just like Sukuna's Dismantle, we have already seen this done through domain expansion and domain amplification. There are several techniques that I have in mind outside of JJK that would work and probably give us the same result. The TSO, or the True Seeking Orbs from Naruto, which are used by 6-pass characters and those with 10 Tails chakra, can definitely nullify infinity just like domain amplification. Within the Naruto series, they can easily nullify jutsu or chakra-based techniques. However, they can't nullify Sage Chakra or Sage Art Jutsu, so maybe depending on verse equalization, things would play out a little bit differently, but again, that's completely up to you. If you're assuming that cursed energy power techniques would be the same as chakra power techniques and not something else entirely like Sage Art, then the TSO orbs or the True Seeking orbs should have no problem nullifying infinity too. Genjutsu or illusionary based techniques are also something that I've gone over heavily in my Sasuke vs Gojo video, so I'm not going to cover that there. Broken Ronin's video also covers this topic insanely well, so make sure you go check it out. There's also energy absorption, which is actually more common than you might think across these conversations. Android 19 and 20 from Dragon Ball can easily intake blast that can wipe out entire planets. Sasuke, using his Renegon, absorbed part of all 9-tailed Biju, and he did this from extremely far away, and he didn't even need to make contact with them once they were already inside Chibaku Tensei. Even with Gojo's almost endless cursed energy production, if Sasuke or any other energy absorbing character managed to absorb energy at a high enough rate over a prolonged period of time, it's possible that infinity at the very least could potentially turn off once Gojo's volume of cursed energy eventually reaches 0. This method does sound incredibly simple until you take a deeper look at what powers Gojo's techniques. Gojo might not have the biggest cursed energy pool compared to Sukuna and Yuta, but it's described as enough to power an entire nation, and specifically the United States. Just to be clear, we aren't given any exact quantification, but let's just assume that it's not for any short period of time, which is pretty reasonable, considering that every military on the planet mobilized to get this new power source because they thought it was going to be just so revolutionary. This could honestly be a lowball, but let's just say it's 1 year's worth of energy. Gojo would need to be generating around 100.2 quadrillion BTUs just during that video shown to the United States government, where he's also likely holding back. Hypothetically, if you can also absorb cursed energy based techniques like Infinity and then take enough energy to power down Infinity with enough volume to hold that much cursed energy that will continuously be produced by Satoru Gojo, then you can actually turn off Infinity. There's also the possibility of gravity manipulation, which tons of other characters outside of JJK possess, from JoJo's, One Piece, and even Naruto. You might think that these characters could just pull Gojo right out of Infinity, but that would depend on your understanding of Newton's law of gravitation. Newton's law of gravitation provides an interesting counter-argument, in that this law states that gravitational forces between two objects depend on their masses and the distance between them. You can see that distance is represented as r right here in the formula. As distance decreases, gravitational force increases, but as r approaches 0, then the forces truly don't become infinite. This means that while the gravity user's pull could become very strong as he decreases the distance, it would never truly reach infinity. Infinity's main strength lies in dividing the space between Gojo and any incoming object, ensuring that r never reaches 0. So while gravity could intensify and decrease the distance, Infinity's effect would keep the distance growing smaller but never completely closed. That also makes a lot of sense when you consider that Kenjaku, who actually has gravity manipulation through Kaori Itadori's anti-gravity system curse technique, didn't attempt to bypass the Infinity. These techniques don't work on Infinity because the infinitely divided distance within Infinity prevents the force from reaching Gojo. Overall, explaining how far Gojo gets outside of JJK completely depends on his opponent's arsenal. Generally, there isn't really much to scale because it's not really about his strength or speed. It's mainly because Infinity not only works automatically and nearly passively, but can also be maintained forever. Gojo's 6 eyes make running out of cursed energy even while using Infinity around the clock nearly impossible. Coupled with this technique's foundation in real-world logic and concepts rooted in mathematics, and we're given something nearly impossible to bypass. Standard battle assumptions and verse equalization don't really give us any clear openings. Gojo's Infinity is extremely powerful and would make him nearly untouchable in many fictional worlds, especially against physical, energy-based, or speed-dependent attacks. However, Infinity has its limits when faced with reality warping, dimensional phasing, or conceptual manipulation. Against characters who can control fundamental aspects of reality or existence itself, Gojo's Infinity may not be enough to protect him. It's just cracked and there's nothing really more to say about it, but once encountering opponents with enough speed or power who also have these incredible techniques, then there's nothing really that can be done. This video is obviously not really taking into account Gojo's opponent's stats or even his stats, but if you want a video that's more about Gojo in a crossverse setting in general and not just about Infinity, then make sure you comment down below.